What do the iconic films Rocky and The Karate Kid have in common? They both have soundtracks that fit their stories so well. That is all because of one man, Bill Conti. But it's not just his work that should be talked about. We also need to talk about how his work influenced both franchises' modern counterparts of Creed and Cobra Kai. Let's talk about the musical godfather of Rocky and The Karate Kid. First, who is Bill Conti? Prior to composing for both Rocky and Karate Kid, Conti had a love for music even as a child. Both his father and grandfather were musicians, and he would attend the opera during his childhood. Conti would attend the Louisiana State University School of Music on a bassoon scholarship and orchestrated pop recordings for Italian artists such as Patti Pravo, and also worked as a ghostwriter for spaghetti western scores. In a fitting manner, just like Sylvester Stallone got his big break with Rocky, Conti also got his big break with the classic 1976 film. Bill Conti would go on to compose for every other Rocky film in the franchise outside of Rocky IV, though Vince DiCola, the composer of Rocky IV, would arrange some of Conti's themes from the previous films. Since he could not compose for Rocky IV since he was busy with the first two Karate Kid movies, Conti also scored Karate Kid Part 2, Part 3, and the next Karate Kid. Some of his other film works include Fist, Master of the Universe, For Your Eyes Only, The Thomas Crown Affair, and another personal favorite of mine outside of Karate Kid and Rocky, Blood In, Blood Out. Bill won an Academy Award for Best Original Score for the film The Right Stuff and won 3 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Musical Direction at the 64th, 70th, and 75th Academy Award ceremonies. What has made Bill Conti's work so effective? In my opinion, part of it stems from his love of classical and orchestral work. In an interview with The Talks, Bill Conti talked about his love of classical music at an early age. But if we're talking about Beethoven and Mozart, we're talking about something that's a little bit more serious, so therefore the rewards are greater. The deeper understanding of a piece of music from some of those great composers is more rewarding. The aesthetic feeling of this type of music is not intellectual, it is just a feeling of awe. To explain how you feel about music, that can be done by a professional, but it's not as important as, are you moved by it? You know, in school, music was advised just the same as sports was advised. Why? To get us in touch with our emotions. That was important that many years ago, and it's still important that your emotional life can be enhanced by and through music. So as a young person, it's easy to be attracted to it. For me, I grew up playing the piano. My father and grandfather were both musicians. We would go often to the opera rather than to the movies. In the same interview, he also mentioned why he chose to use orchestral musicians for Rocky instead of synthesizers that had become popular in the 1970s, and also commented on the use of electronics in today's modern film scores. Rocky's director John Avildsen told me that this was a classic tale, that it should be classic in its feeling. It takes place in Philadelphia, though, so it should be contemporary as well. I felt that a certain sound could be created only if you had so many players. Sure, you could do it with just a piano, with just a guitar, or even, as you say, with just a synthesizer. But for example, the sound of the trumpets in Rocky is done with 6 trumpets, and if you had 3 trumpets, it wouldn't sound the same. So that choice was aesthetic. I felt that I could only make that sound with so many players, and since I'm the guy that's writing the music, I have to do what I feel is right. Music is a universal thing. Yes, it's done by a computer. Yes, it's done by one person all alone in a room, and it's all electronics. But as long as someone's crying, then they get it. With movie music, it isn't necessarily about is it good or bad, but is it effective? If it's supposed to scare you, does it scare you? Did you fall in love when she looked at him and he looked at her and the music began? And whether it was violin, a piano, guitar, or just electronics, did it help you fall in love? Was it effective? That's the criteria. As Conti just mentioned, I think another reason why his work is so effective is that he's not afraid to have an open mind when it comes to music in general. In fact, he would even use synthesizers in some of his musical works, one example being Daniel's Moment of Truth in The Karate Kid, and another being Redemption from Rocky II. Another example of his use of unique instrumentation is using a pan flute, notably for a lot of Mr. Miyagi or Miyagi-Do motifs in the Karate Kid soundtracks, giving the scenes that extra aura and further bringing characters like Mr. Miyagi to life. His music helps tell the story, whether it's Rocky's training going so well that he could fly at any moment, Daniel LaRusso taking his training seriously and begins to practice the movements Mr. Miyagi taught him, how the lives of 3 cousins diverge and change forever, or for a husband waiting for their loved one to awaken from a coma. The instrumentation used is perfect in every song that Conti scores and never fails to capture the emotion of a scene. In an interview with Gig Sluts, he chose this instrumentation because, in the 1950s and 60s, the composers I grew up listening to and who made the greatest impression on me were Miklos Rozsa and the soundtracks to his big brass-led Roman picture scores, and Lalo Schifrin, who was an excellent composer. So I always wanted to write the big loud stuff. For example, I grew up listening to opera in Il Cavaliere Rusticana by Pietro Mascagni before I was 6 years old. The end piece of Rocky over the credits is a fugue for strings alone, and if in a way it makes it more classic sounding, it's intentional because in the beginning when John Avildsen had begun shooting the film, he invited me up to his house to watch the dailies and he would be playing Beethoven. He told me he saw Rocky's story as a classic fairy tale, to which I added, what about the streets of Philadelphia? Suppose I try to combine the two? In other words, to keep in mind that you want this to be a classic story, but with the added life of the Philadelphia streets. The classical feel was totally intentional. What are some of Bill Conti's memorable tracks from the Rocky franchise, and how has that influenced the composers of Creed? It goes without saying that perhaps the most memorable is Gonna Fly Now, which is present in some form of every Rocky film. Bill Conti famously said that after reading the script that the score was about a loser. He composed the melancholy piano motif first, but the director John Avildsen said, "Bill, I need a minute and a half worth of music, because it is easier to cut a film in a montage if there is a beat." So I said, sure. Now John has shot about 5 miles of film, running up the stairs, training with the medicine ball, doing push-ups, so he says, I need another 30 seconds. Then, could I get another 30 seconds? So in other words, we started patching together 3 minutes of music in 30-second increments until we got there. Avildsen said, he's jumping up and down, almost like he's gonna fly at any moment. What's also interesting is that each incarnation of the track uses different instrumentation for each film, which closely matches either the scene or tone of that film. For example, the Rocky III variation uses a lot more guitar, as it complements the normally orchestral track nicely. This could symbolize Apollo's influence in Rocky's training as mixing both old school and new school together, and Rocky's willingness to adapt his training methods. Other tracks worth mentioning are Going the Distance and The Final Bell, which share a similar motif and express Rocky's desire to not necessarily win the fight, but to prove to himself that he could survive and make it until the end. Conquest, which is used in both Rocky and Apollo's second match and Rocky and Clubber's second match, represent Rocky's willingness to win and take back what's his, whether it was nearly beating the champion and knowing he could beat him this time, or taking back the title and proving that he was as good as those around him believed him to be. Lastly, Vigil, which plays when Rocky's by Adrian's side during her coma in Rocky II, and Mickey, which plays during Mickey's death in Rocky III, and also during Rocky's flashback with Mickey in Rocky V, are two very similar tracks using very similar instrumentation, such as a single horn being prominent during respective parts of their track as the solo piece, and convey the uneasiness of Rocky dealing with his partner's health and the death of his trainer. Ludwig Göransson, the composer of Creed and Creed II, studied the music of the franchise extensively, and along with both hip-hop and modernized orchestral arrangements, made a fitting soundtrack that felt like a modern-day Rocky film. Specifically in the tracks from Creed 1 and 2, including First Date, You're a Creed, You Can See the Whole Town From Here, and It's Your Time, Ludwig samples Going the Distance and Gonna Fly Now, respectively. Even in the original tracks that don't sample Conti's work directly, such as Meeting Rocky, Conlon Redemption, Moving In with Rocky, If I Fight You Fight, Fight in Moscow, and Underwater, have the same type of storytelling that is prevalent in the Rocky films. Joseph Shirley, who worked as part of Ludwig Göransson's scoring team as a technical score engineer and score programmer, would compose for Creed 3 and keep the same type of feel for this film's soundtrack, even referencing The Final Bell in the track Round 12, where Adonis wins the film's final fight. Both Creed composers have done a phenomenal job of using the same type of atmosphere to express the emotions with each track paired with scenes, whether those moments are inspirational, impactful, heartbreaking, or even fun. What are some of the memorable tracks in the Karate Kid films, and how has that influenced the music of Cobra Kai? There are so many to name, but I'll just name a few off the top of my head. Miyagi Intercedes, which uses some of the same motif that's also present in Onto Miyagi's Fishing Train and some of Daniel Sees the Bird, is a great example of how Conti uses a unique instrument such as the pan flute to make Mr. Miyagi seem like such an important and powerful character. With the other instrumentation, you feel at peace and are intrigued by the origins of Miyagi's background. In Karate Kid Part 2, the track Breathing, Daniel Nails It reuses some of the same motifs from the first film, but also adds some more instrumentation to reflect the difference in the change of journey and technique. In Karate Kid Part 3, the motifs associated with Terry Silver in the tracks such as his namesake, Terry's next move, Terry owns Daniel, and Daniel submits stand out in such a unique way. You just know that no matter what, this guy is trouble. I find it very interesting that the music matches his character so well, as it makes him out to be a classic and bigger-than-life villain, almost like something you would hear in a different era. In the tracks Daniel's Resolution and Miyagi Kicks Butt, we hear some of the classic Miyagi-Do motifs again, but there are drums that add to the mood of each scene, whether it's Daniel resolving to abandon his Cobra Kai ways, or Miyagi locks in a classic fight between Kreese and Silver. Last but not least, in the next Karate Kid, the main melody and motif that was present in the main title and Daniel's Moment of Truth tracks is prevalent in the tracks such as Train Yard Emotions and Training Montage, linking the two Miyagi-Do students together, while also bringing back Miyagi's classic string motif in tracks such as Miyagi's Big Fight. Leo Barenberg and Zach Robinson, similar to Ludwig Göransson and Joseph Shirley, heavily studied Bill Conti's work and either reference the original work or create themes that carry on the same spirit of the Karate Kid franchise. Over the current 5 seasons, there are so many samples to list, but one of my favorite examples is the track The Wrong Path, which plays when Daniel reconciles with Robbie before the final fight of the 50th All-Valley Tournament. I personally love this track because while it calls back to the motifs present in Fish and Train from the original soundtrack, it does it in a faint manner, almost as if to say that while Daniel is given his own Miyagi-like wisdom, he's not quite there yet as a sensei. In terms of songs that carry the spirit of the Karate Kid franchise, there's no denying that we can't talk about the tracks Quiver, Hallway Hellscape, Cobra Effect, and The Tree Will Survive. Perhaps breaking down the soundtrack for both franchises either movie by movie, or in Cobra Kai's case season by season, is a video that I'll have to follow up with, as there's only so much I can say without going overboard. A note here in post-production. There's a specific scene in Cobra Kai that references the Rocky franchise in a musical cue. In Season 4, Episode 1, Let's Begin, Miguel Diaz urges Johnny Lawrence to work with Daniel LaRusso by bringing up one of Johnny's favorite movies as an example, Rocky III. Right when he mentions those words, we hear a familiar bell referencing the track Going the Distance in the background. It's also worth mentioning that most of the musical tracks heard throughout the last 2 episodes of the season during the All-Valley Tournament are heavily inspired by Vince DiCola's score in Rocky IV, which in turn was inspired by Bill Conti's previous score in the Rocky films. Truly a full circle moment for both franchises. Did Bill Conti influence the pop songs used for these films? I think that goes without saying, but it's still interesting to look at. For example, while Conti was not involved directly with Rocky IV, Hearts on Fire mixes perfectly with Up the Mountain by Vince DiCola, which plays when Rocky climbs up the mountain. As he's reaching the top, there's an interpolation of Gonna Fly Now. This is also more prevalent in the Karate Kid series, as Feel the Night's melody is not only part of the main title track, but is also heard in Decorate the Gym, Troubled Lovers, and The Kiss. This motif is typically associated with Ali or Daniel and Ali together. Bill Conti's work also pairs nicely with No Shelter by Broken Edge during the Halloween fight scene, as it complements the track Miyagi Rattles Bones. This technique is also used in Karate Kid Part 2, as Daniel Breaks the Ice is a near perfect mashup with Rock and Roll Over You by the Moody Blues. I'm not sure if these tracks were picked first and then Conti composed the score to work around these pieces, but it's something that can't be overlooked. Some honorable mentions would be You're the Best Around in Karate Kid and Runnin' in Creed 2. While the famous tournament montage theme doesn't have any nods to Conti's score, one can't help but wonder that if guitars were more prominent on the soundtrack, it could fit well for the theme of the Cobra Kai dojo. Run-In from Creed 2 is definitely more of Ludwig Göransson's work based off his Adonis motifs, but it does quote similar vocals to Gonna Fly Now, just like If I Fight You Fight did from the first Creed soundtrack. There's no denying that if it wasn't for the genius of Bill Conti, the two titanic franchises of Rocky and Karate Kid would be vastly different today. His technique of mixing classic orchestral music with unique and sometimes modern instruments puts him in another league above the rest. Perhaps his music is also what makes these films so enjoyable, as he's able to complement these characters with excellent music and motifs, and has set the standard of what every film composer should aspire to be, memorable so your audience can remember the way they felt when hearing that music. All I can say is thank you, Bill Conti. You've made the world a better place with your musical contributions. If you like this video, check out my detailed analysis on the characters of both of the universes I talked about in this video, because I specifically talked about how Cobra Kai intentionally made Johnny the next Mr. Miyagi, and the proof is in the music cues. Also, a special thanks to Rich for the super chats and for suggesting this video. Thanks for watching, stay beautiful, stay awesome, we'll catch you around next time.